Hello, this is Dr. Bob Shield. This is the sixth part of our eight-part series on the history of the Mass. I call this the Latin Mass, the beginning of the Mass that many of us know and remember. In this particular part, part 6a, I call the Mass of St. Pius V, which came after the Council of Trent. You see at the bottom of the page, the years we're talking about take us from the middle of the 1500s all the way to the Second Vatican Council. The two pictures you see, oil painting in Europe of the Council of Trent, of course, no photography in those days, give you some idea of what the assembly looked like. In the lower right-hand corner, we find in black and white a very typical, iconic image of the Latin Mass, the priest facing the wall, his back to the people, two servers. The high Mass candles are lighted, you see, and if you look at his fingers, he is holding his thumb and his index finger together, which means this Mass is after the consecration. We'll talk about those things as we go through this. Let me begin with a very good summary, I think, of where we're going in this particular unit, and that is the Council of Trent was the 19th ecumenical council of the Church. It was held in Trent, Italy. If you don't know where Trent is, I provided a map, and there is the city. Northern, northeastern Italy, very close to Austria and Switzerland and Slovakia. The years of the council were from 1545 to 1563. Not all the sessions were held in Trent, as you can see. The popes during this period, who were, at least for a short period of time, because poor Pope Marcellinus II was not Pope very long. He died soon after he was elevated. But there was a Pope Paul III, Julius III, Marcellinus II, and Pius IV. The council was held during the reign of two emperors, Charles V and Ferdinand II. The developments and abuses of this era, which really is the close of the Middle Ages, if historians can't decide what particular range of dates was the close of the Middle Ages, I choose the 1300 to 1500. When we speak of the close of the Middle Ages, it expresses the history of the liturgy of the Church best, a closing, and not the least, of the Mass. On the other hand, right off the bat, we want to say that there was a growth, very rich and very manifold, within the Church, and that was church music. Church music thrived in this period. On the other hand, scholastic theology, which produced nothing in this period for the liturgy of the Mass. In other words, growth in the eyes of the theology of the schools became very dry and withered. The optimism of church music does not hold true for the text of the Mass order, organization of the Mass. All the silent prayers of the priests continued. All these became more or less in the background because they were for the priest only, as you can imagine. And as we saw in the previous parts, that the reverence for the Blessed Sacrament led to a change in policy regarding handling of the sacred host by lay people. No lay hand was allowed to touch it, and from that followed even touching the sacred vessels. The corporal, that piece of cloth that's laid down on which the body of Christ will lie, and the cup of his sacred blood, it was often shown more honor that amounted to superstition. For instance, in washing it, prayers were said. More and more what the Latinists call the pericula and the defecta, dangers and defects, which might occur in the Mass, grew and grew, spilling the chalice, dropping a particle of the host. Stern punishments were prescribed. New dangers were constantly being discovered. Preaching and teaching of the sacrament were all one-sided discussions, unenlightened, isolated, popularizing, devotional, less theology, more devotion. And some of it was on the effects of the Mass. Now, while theology did not approve of these exaggerations, the fruits multiplied from only 4 fruits, meaning what are the effects of the Mass, from 5 to 10 and then 12. For instance, one example is that if people attended Mass, they would be saved merely by hearing Mass. Unbelievable. Go wonder Luther had problems with the church. The use of votive masses. What's a votive mass? Well, the name is it. Votive, our English word to vote comes from it. It means a choice. Masses, do you have a choice to say? Were offered for the most exaggerated reasons, against sicknesses, against dangers to right and property, against attacks by the enemy. And the interesting thing, which was so non-theological, is that particular masses being thought to obtain certain specified results. In other words, if you offered this mass, you got this effect. Masses were being offered in particular series, 10 in a row, 15, 30, 100, 300. They specified the number of candles, the specific number of alms gifts that were stipulated, with the assurance of unfailing results. That's superstition. Created extravagant promises to the Mass. Then there developed an unnatural multiplication of Masses, and with it an unnatural increase in clergy who derived their entire income from Masses by way of stipends. That's all they did. And the most celebrated of the Masses were votive Masses, especially Masses for the dead. I remember before Vatican II, an entire week or more of Masses in a church would be Requiem Masses, black vestments. Because only one sung Mass could be celebrated in a church at a time, given the choir was occupied, clergy created what they called boxed Masses, where several such Masses could be celebrated in close and overlapping succession. So by the time of the final blessing in one Mass, the next Mass had already begun. Some bishops sought to curb abuses. There was a lot of those who meant goodwill by creating requirements for Mass books. By Mass books, we simply mean the missal, the instructions for praying and the prayers for praying. They should be assembled, they thought, at certain places, right, and corrected by one person who was stipulated to correct it. And they needed one copy, which was unobjectionable. The church became an object of scorn and ridicule and was repudiated as a horrible idolatry by entire people. The groundwork was set for Luther, and he came on the world stage. Complaints raised by the reformers were aimed accurately and quite relentlessly against questionable points in church texts regarding the Mass. For instance, the fruits of the Mass, the votive Mass, the commerce, praying, this stipend thing. The pictures of a number of the reformers. We often think of only Luther, but there were quite a few. Speaking of Luther, he was born November 10th in 1483 in Eisleben, Germany, and he died on February 18th, 1546. He was a German monk who started the Protestant Reformation without quite intending to. Martin Luther changed the course of Christianity and Western history. His 1517 complaint against specific abuses in the Roman Catholic Church, and we know them as the 95 Theses, sparked the explosive Protestant Reformation that swept Europe for the rest of the century. In the right-hand picture, you have a picture of him tacking up on the door of the parish church the 95 Theses. The parish church is not unusual. This was the bulletin board. That's how you learn what was going on in the town, and that's where he posted his first attempt to criticize the church publicly. He was born in a Roman Catholic family. His father was a copper miner. He graduated from the University of Erfurt in 1505, but he abandoned his legal studies, assuming he was going to become a lawyer, and entered the Augustinian monastery, the order of priests founded in the name of St. Augustine. He was ordained to the priesthood in 1507. By 1512, he was a doctor of theology and a Bible professor at the University of Wittenberg. He was a gifted preacher, but his theology began to clash with that of the Catholic Church. He wrote that salvation came not by any human work, and by human work he meant anything from a sacrament to a Mass being said, but by absolute faith in God's promise of forgiveness on account of Jesus Christ. He didn't anticipate the uproar touched off by the 95 Theses he sent to the bishop and archbishop to protest indulgences being sold by the Catholic hierarchy under Pope Leo X. His controversial beliefs earned him excommunication from the church, but he pressed on with many new followers. He certainly won the German princes of the day, and they in many ways gave him refuge. Luther produced a German translation. Now, people laud this as the first translation into a vernacular language of the Bible. Absolutely false. There are already 6 or 7 existing translations, and we know today that Luther plagiarized from other existing translations the German translation he passed off as his own. And he developed a new form of Christian worship that emphasized preaching and popular hymns. He permitted the clergy to marry and honored ordinary life in the world as a field for God's service versus the role or the place for religious orders. In 1525, he married a former nun, Katharina von Bora, 16 years younger than he. They had 6 children. His hymn, A Mighty Fortress is Our God, which he wrote about 1529, had been translated into more than 50 languages. His particular theology, he denied the sacrificial character of the Mass, that the Mass in any way was associated with a sacrifice. For him, the Eucharist was only a testament, what he called a bequest and benefit handed us. And as such, this is Luther's rash conclusion, in no way was it a benefit or good work that we can offer to God in order to merit from him something for ourselves and especially for others. Therefore, the Mass cannot be said either for the living or the dead, he thought. All prayers in the Mass and liturgy in which there is any mention of this, particularly of sacrifice, like in the canon, are bad human additions and must be dropped. A special work of Luther's deals with the abomination of the low masses called the canon. He made charges that masses, especially masses for poor souls, were means of fleecing the people. Enter the Council of Trent. Lasted 18 years, the 5 popes, we've seen them already, and emperors. There were also present 5 cardinal legates of the Holy See. There were 3 patriarchs, 200 bishops, 7 abbots, and 7 generals of monastic orders, and representatives of kings and princes. It was convoked to examine and condemn the errors promulgated by Luther and other reformers, and to reform the discipline of the Church. Of all councils in the history of the Church, it lasted longest, issued the largest number of dogmatic and reformatory decrees, and produced the most beneficial results. Trent condemned the heresies of Luther, Calvin, and the other reformers. It issued decrees on the Church's teaching on the Eucharist, the holy sacrifice of the Mass, the sacraments, notably baptism and holy orders, and teachings on marriage, purgatory, indulgences, and the use of images. The remaining tasks begun by Pope Pius IV were continued by his successor, Pope St. Pius V. Number 1, that was reforming the Missal, Mass, book, and the Breviary, the prayers for every day of the year for priests and religious, the writing of the Catechism based on the decrees of Trent, and appointing a commission to issue a more exact edition of the Latin Vulgate. The original Latin Vulgate translated, which was St. Jerome's translation into Latin from the Greek and Hebrew of the entire Bible, needed a better edition with a better translation, and the reforming of morals. The developments in abuses and the reform, the council took up the matter of reform from 1546 to 1547, they considered the use and misuse of Holy Scripture, and it touched on the question of the Mass book, the standardization of the Latin Mass. A special commission was tasked to collect the abuses of the Mass, the abusus missae. Among the abuses were saints, sequences, and prefaces with legendary content. You know, the Mass is offered for in honor of the feasts of saints. They had stories that were legendary instead of truth. There were prayers for peace, prayers in need, various chants after the consecration, new Mass formularies of questionable origin that includes most of the votive Masses, the series of Masses, setting aside the order of Sundays and the church year in favor of private chosen formularies. Add the great variety of Mass rites, and there were many kinds of rites throughout Europe. Not even in the same church was the same rite observed. Confusion grew all the more with the start of the Reformation era. Priests took it upon themselves to start their own reform. Many priests even left out the canon, for instance, priests in Austria. It sounds similar to the period of Vatican II, you're correct. The Commission did not neglect anything. the custom of saying private masses in church while the high mass is going on, saying masses without at least 2 participants present, the need for a certain consistency at least at the beginning and the conclusion of Mass. And they passed a decree, the decree on those things to be observed and avoided in the celebration of Mass. They issued this on September 17th, 1562. It was concerned only with the most obvious abuses and evil conditions. Number one, bishops should be vigilant about stipends. Mass should be celebrated only in sacred places. Disturbing and irreverent conduct and frivolous music must be banished. Capriciousness of priests regarding rites and prayers at Mass. The superstitious observance of numbers for fixed Masses would have to cease. Unfortunately, with this commission, there was no mention of the reform of the Missal. Here in a glance, I hope, you'd be disappointed if I didn't have a summary timeline, is the history that we're talking about. The beginning of the Council of Trent in 1545, ending in 1563, and I have the popes who reigned during this period and their period of their papacy, Pope Paul III, Julius III, good old short-lived Marcellinus II, Pope Paul IV, Pope Pius IV, of course, and then the end of the council. And then we have the man we most honor in this particular unit is Pope St. Pius V. He issued the reform of the Mass on July 14th, 1570. And he issued the decree, the restored Roman Missal, by decree of the Most Holy Council of Trent by Pius V, Holy Pontiff, is now issued. All right, so it was binding on the whole Western Church. It established once and for all the wished-for uniform Missal. In truth, we had as a church a Roman Missal. Now, for centuries, popes did not enforce their own rite. I mean, there were popes who were of different rites, in other words, different formulations, different ways of saying them. Always the essentials were there, but sometimes the language differences, for instance. And they did not enforce uniformity. Many popes were content in allowing the usage of other rites that were valid and pleasing to God. Pope St. Gregory the Great, for instance, who reigned from 590 to 604, he told St. Augustine to use whatever rites he thought were suitable. But again, they must be valid and pleasing to God. Pope St. Gregory finished his Gregorian Sacramentary, which we mentioned a few units ago, one of the many books of rites containing the prayers of the Mass used by the priests at the altar. And this is the Gregorian Sacramentary. Essentially, it is the Mass that Pope St. Pius V in 1570 standardized, or set in stone through his papal bull. The Latin for that is quo primum tempore. Now, I know as the laughter subsides, we always laugh at the term bull. Unfortunately, it has other meanings in English. But a papal bull is an apostolic letter with a leaden seal. Now, I've got a picture of a letter with a seal, and normally we expect a wax seal, but for things as important as a decree of a pope, it's placed in lead, so it cannot be easily destroyed. So papal means pertaining to a pope. Bull refers to the bulla, which is the seal affixed to the documents for authentication. The Pope's use of the bulla gave rise to the practice of referring to the documents themselves as papal bulls. Pius V did not invent an entirely new and experimental rite of Mass, but simply codified and set in stone that which has already been around for almost 1,000 years, and that is still used for the past 1,400 years. The Council of Trent wished the Roman Mass to be said uniformly everywhere. The Roman Mass essentially has been said since the time of Gregory the Great in Rome for 1,400 years, but uniformity across the Western Church wasn't enforced until Pope Pius V's decree in 1570. And that's the quo primum in the form of a bull used for important and permanent decrees and is binding to those for whom they are issued. The Catholic Catechism of the Council of Trent said one of the first acts of the new pontiff, which is Pius V, was to appoint a number of expert theological revisers to examine every statement in the Catechism from the viewpoint of doctrine. Now, in his brief pontificate, This is a good man. Pope Pius V vigorously promulgated the decrees of the Council of Trent, number 1. That was a big enough job. He issued the Roman Missal, the revised breviary, and the Catechism of the Council of Trent, all of which has served the Church for more than 400 years. You can buy a Catechism of the Council of Trent online or in bookstores today. Plus, he excommunicated Elizabeth I of England, established the Index of Forbidden Books. He chose 314 bishops, wrote hundreds of bulls, and gathered an allied Christian force which destroyed the Turkish or the Muslim fleet at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, bringing to end their dominance of the Mediterranean Sea. And there is a fresco that had been painted commemorating the victory. It's quite a guy. I don't know when he slept. Now, there are two arguments, as we're going to see. One argument against changing the Latin Rite comes from those who believe that no Pope had the right to change anything that Pope St. Pius V decreed in his papal bull Quo Primum. And they stand on that because they say that he wrote, and he did, "We order and enjoin that nothing must be added to our recently published missal, nothing omitted from it, nor anything whatsoever be changed within it." Now, number one, there's no question he would not include Roman pontiffs, popes who would follow him. They would have the same authority he had for issuing the decree. And secondly, it was not an act of infallibility, because it was not a matter of either faith or doctrine. Now, of course, this did not exclude changes by a pope. Pius V himself added to the missal the Feast of Our Lady of Victory to celebrate the victory of Lepanto, which we just saw. His immediate successor, Pope Gregory XIII, changed the name of this feast, Our Lady of Victory, to the Most Holy Rosary of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and Blessed Pope John the 23rd in our own time changed it to Our Lady of the Rosary. So Pope Pius V's work in severely reducing the number of feasts in the Roman calendar was very soon further undone by his successors. This is what popes do with their authority. Feasts that he had abolished, such as those of the Presentation of Mary, St. Anne, and St. Anthony of Padua, were restored even before Clement the 8th, 1604, typical edition of the Missal was issued. In the course of following centuries, new feasts were repeatedly added, and the ranks of certain feasts were raised or lowered. A comparison between Pius V's Tridentine calendar and the general Roman calendar of 1954 in our own day shows the changes made from 1570 to 1954. Pius XII, from the left here, made a general revision in 1955, and Blessed John the 23rd made further general revisions in 1960, simplifying the terminology concerning the ranking of liturgical celebrations. Now, the intent of the Commission and Pope Pius V was to engage the basic form of the Eucharistic liturgy from distorting additions. They thoroughly investigated the ancient sources. The final missal was brought to what they called the pristine norm and rite of the Holy Fathers. Among the accomplishments of the decree of the Commission and the Pope was purifying the Mass book of disturbing accessories. Their work was done with remarkable energy. Members were not held back at all. They did nothing to hinder, first of all, that great glory of this age, and that was the polyphonic music of the era. Now, regarding communion, the decree disavowed the case for the chalice for the laity. Why would they stop giving the sacred blood to laity? A lot of reasons. Their experiences were not favorable. It is difficult to distribute a liquid. Spoilage. The habit we know of the excessive consumption, one person emptying the cup. The Commission tried to focus once more on the grand outlines of the Christian sacrificial celebration. They did recommend, of course, that the faithful receive communion each time they come to Mass. Clearly not the practice of their day. Now, such a broad and sweeping unification could never have been completely accomplished before the day of the printing press. It was really God's preparation for the distribution of this missal. Gutenberg invented the printing press we know, and the first book he printed was the Bible in 1455. The next step in renewal was the renewal for Pope Sixtus V was his constitution called Immensa on January 1580, which founded the Congregation of Rites, the commission that Pius V created. Ended with the publication of the Missal. Now we needed a group, a congregation to continue. Its tasks were to see to it that everywhere in the Latin Church the prescribed manner of celebrating Mass and performing the other functions of the liturgy were carefully followed. It was charged with the duty of seeing the status of things established by the Missal of Pius V be in no way altered or endangered. The greatest and most consequential innovation of the Mass book of Pius V was the enactment, clearly expressed in the Bull of Introduction, that this book was to be from then on the standard in every church, and that no changes were to be made therein. There were other real changes since the 16th century, so other popes knew that they were not limited to what Pope Pius V had decreed. For instance, the new edition of the Missal under Clement VIII in 1604 were that the biblical chant pieces arbitrarily changed to the new Vulgate translation be restored. Added new regulation regarding the final blessing. Another new edition of the Mass book was ordered by Urban VIII in 1634. Wording of rubrics were greatly improved. The revision of hymns was carried out in the few new hymns of the Missal. The reform of Pope St. Pius X in 1920 was the next revision of the Missal. He included an increase in saints' feast days, but did not affect the arrangement of the Mass. Pope Clement XIII in 1764 added the preface of the Holy Trinity for Sundays, and Pope Leo XIII in 1902 ordered the prayers to be said after the Low Mass. Okay, this is the end of Part 6a of the Mass of the Council of Trent. You can go now to the Mass of the Council of Trent, Part 6b.